Wonderful. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for being here. Welcome to our April Lexalign webinar. It's wonderful to see so many returning faces as well as lots of new ones today. Thank you for taking time out of your Friday. I know it's a very busy time of year for everyone. So today we are, of course, talking about preparing and empowering your ACH originators for the new fraud monitoring rules and requirements that are upon us, right? And we know this is a topic many of you are thinking about, you're planning for it, you're discussing it at your institutions. And we're very glad to be with you on that journey because it is a journey. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Julie Goff. I lead operations at Lexalign. I am joined by Trevor Lain, who is our founder and CEO here at Lexalign. And you're going to hear from Trevor in just a moment. But if you were wondering, if you were the only financial institution in the US here in April thinking about and planning for these rules around your originators, I can assure you that you are in excellent company because we have about 50 financial institutions represented on today's call. So you are in wonderful company, financial institutions of all sizes from all across the country. We're here learning together. So with that, let's start off, I think, with a little poll to kind of see where everybody's at here on April 24th, 2026. So two questions for you. How many of you have started some form of a conversation with your originators around the new rules already as of April 24th? Yes, no, kind of, sort of. Um, and then second part of the question is, how are you doing that? Or how are you planning to do that, right? Are you doing direct outreach to your originators, maybe email, mailings, educational webinars, maybe in-person sessions? We've heard that before. Web pages. Are you mailing the rule book to originators, a questionnaire or other? So go ahead, put your answers in there and let us know. And then we'll show the results here in just a moment. All right, what do we got? All right, very cool. Okay, so a little bit of a split crowd. This is great. About half of you said yes, you've started conversations with your originators. Some of you have said no, and about almost half of you said sort of. So that kind of gives you a sense of where everybody is at, right? We're kind of all on this journey together. Some of you are doing direct outreach, quite a bit of you, web page, as well as the Nacha rulebook, about a third. There you go. Questionnaires, and then about a third of you are doing other. All right, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. We can close that down. All right, so today's session, we are going to look at the rules together and really break them down and figure out what they mean and try to make them clearer and more actionable as we head into this new era of the fraud monitoring rules. And our hope for you today is that you leave more confident, right? This is a brand new era that's upon us. How do we break down these rules and build confidence that this is very doable? So today's session, this is educational and informational. Please continue to work with your legal counsel, your compliance teams, as you put together your plan for the new rules. So this is just educational for all of us. All right, so let's start with some context, shall we? So anytime we see new rules coming onto the scene with respect to regulation, frameworks, et cetera, right? It's usually in response to something that's happening in our world, something that's happening in our industry, something that's happening in our technology, that's forcing us to shift gears, right? And so what is happening today in 2026? And that is fraud, right? Fraud is upon us. And not just fraud in the guy who's in his basement trying to scam a few bucks away from us, right? This is fraud that has been industrialized on a global scale, massive amounts of dollars. This is organized crime. Human trafficking is now involved. So we have forced labor, massive amounts of dollars and technology being put into all of this. And these images here that you see on the screen, these are fraud factories. So these are industrial complexes where people are being forced to live and to work and to perpetrate fraud. And they're being given all sorts of technology to go about doing that. And if we think about where these threats are coming from, right? Fraud factories and all of this sort of used to be happening in a few pockets around the globe. and now it's expanding. So you can see here from this map over the past couple years, massive expansion. And then when it comes to the fraud statistics, right? I'm sure you see more fraud statistics than you care to stomach on any given day. But the general story when we're thinking about fraud day in and day out is it's growing, right? And it's especially hitting our business customers, our commercial customers. And the statistic that I want to point out here is 4.5 times more profitable. So AI-driven scams are 4.5 times more profitable than traditional ways of approaching scams, right? So that means that criminals are successful in doing this, they're making money, and that means they're going to continue to invest and put more behind this to perpetrate fraud. So when we think about the fraud itself and how it's kind of happening to us and to our customers, what does it look like and how have fraud shifted that is going to bring us to the rules? Well, very simply, fraud used to be unauthorized debits, right? A fraudster was coming to try to take money out of my account through a transaction that wasn't me, trying to pull money out of my account by faking a transaction or a transaction that wasn't originated by me. This was relatively easy for financial institutions to detect, right? Because I've been a customer at my bank for 20 years. They know what Julie's spending habits look like. Pretty easy to detect if a transaction isn't me. And so it becomes a little easier to stop, to reverse, and to figure out what's not normal. Now we've moved into an era where we're seeing lots of fraudulently induced credits. So that means money being pushed out of an account, often by a customer, right? So they might be duped by a fraudster to push money out of their account, or maybe it's that unauthorized account takeover where they have credentials to my account to move money out. And so customers or somebody without or with unauthorized access is pushing money out of an account in order to commit that fraud. And what is happening more and more is that fraudsters and criminals are studying the patterns of our customers, right? So the fraud that they are perpetrating looks more and more like actual real business, right? Real transactions that our customers are doing. And this is really why we're starting to see Nacha bring these new rules onto the scene. So the fraudsters are not attacking the bank anymore. They're attacking our originators, right? They are going out to those places of business, trying to scam, dupe, right? We hear about business email compromise, impersonation, all of those things that is causing a person at your customer to be duped into pushing money out, right? Creating that entry. And so once it gets to the financial institution, all you see is that entry as it's submitted, right? You don't necessarily see what happened upstream at your ACH originator's place of business, and how that all came to be, right? You don't see the backstory, unfortunately. So this is what brings us to what we like to think about as kind of the new perimeter for fraud monitoring, right? It used to be protecting your financial institution was really hardening the four walls of the bank, right? Making sure money couldn't move in or out that wasn't authorized, making sure no one could gain access to your systems to try to move money out. And now the perimeter of ACH fraud monitoring has massively expanded. So the front door of the bank is kind of everywhere now, right? It sits with your originators, your third-party senders, out in their places of business. That is where fraudsters are looking to commit and perpetrate fraud and get that money that we talked about on those statistics. So is this all new? How did we get here? Well, no, this did not happen overnight. This has been kind of coming forward over the last couple years. So back in 2022, you can go back and look at some of the blogs and bulletins that Nacha put out. They were starting to educate financial institutions about this new era of credit push fraud, what it was, what it meant, how to start protecting your institution. And then in 2024, we saw the new rules, of course, published and announced. And then we had about 2 years to get ready. So here we are in April. Of course, the March 20th deadline for phase 1 has already happened. And we're all thinking quite a bit about phase 2 and getting ready for June 22nd, which I suspect is why many of you are here today. So let's kind of dive into that. All right, so we're going to look at the rules. We promised you we'd look at the rules and kind of break them down and break them apart and think about what they mean. So let's start here. We're in Article 2 of the operating rules. In Section 2.1, we have the foundational responsibility. So the general rule for ODFIs, and this talks about really two primary responsibilities, right? The ODFI is responsible for all entries originated through your institution, and the ODFI is responsible for its originator's compliance, right? So this is the general rule. It's been around for a while. It hasn't gone anywhere. It's still with us, but we're going to kind of look at this through new eyes now that we have our new fraud monitoring rules on the scene. So, in essence, you've heard this said many times before, right? ODFIs are on the hook for everything your originators do, everything. And so this has not changed, but how you fulfill that duty is going to evolve because we have these new requirements and the perimeter is expanding. So let's talk about what those rules are and what they require, right? This is the part that we're all trying to get our heads around this year. So let's look first at subsection 2.2.4. And this is the new kid on the block. This is the fraud monitoring rule. So this is brand new inside of the operating rules. We're still in Article 2. And this is talking about the identification of unauthorized entries or entries authorized under false pretenses, right? So back to, remember we talked about the context. What is the type of fraud that's being perpetrated that we need to be vigilant and cognizant of? So this rule is talking about all participants, right? Each non-consumer originator, each third-party sender, each ODFI, each third-party service provider, right, must establish and implement risk-based processes and procedures, right, that are reasonably intended to identify entries that are suspected of being unauthorized or authorized under false pretenses. Remember, we talked about those being kind of the two modes of possible fraud. And then Part B is telling us these processes and these procedures need to be reviewed at least annually to try to keep up with the risks and the threats as they evolve. So let's press in a little bit to 2.2.4 and kind of look at the words that are here. So first in that part A, we see establish and implement, right? Those are two separate words that we want to think about. And so what does establish mean, right? Establish means, design, craft, create something. And then implement means you actually have to do it, right? So establish and implement. So this is signaling to us that having just a written policy on the shelf is likely no longer sufficient, right? The rules are asking everyone to be doing more. Then we have risk-based, right? I know you have probably thought already about that phrase in the rules because this is new. So risk-based means what? It's not all a one size fits all. All of your originators are not all the same. Every risk doesn't present the same amount of threat to your institution. So how do you focus your energy and your resources where there is the most risk? And then finally, at least annually, right? And we've heard Nacha say at least annually is the bare minimum, right? Fraudsters are not sitting around updating the way they work once a year. So it is probably advisable and wise to think about updating more than just once a year. But annually is the baseline and the standard or the minimum. Okay, let's talk about this phrase false pretenses, right? You've probably thought about this a little bit already. What does false pretenses mean? Well, this is kind of a fancy way to just say scam or fraud, right? And in the ACH context, this is talking about the inducement of a payment by an originator when someone is misrepresenting something about the receiver, right? So it's not the person who it should be, right? Going to that receiver. So that person is misrepresenting a receiver's identity, maybe misrepresenting a receiver's authority or authorization, right? Or even ownership of that account. So we need to be careful about these scenarios in order to not push money to a receiver under false pretenses. Okay, so we've looked at section 2.1. We've looked at our new kid on the block, 2.2.4. What are those rules in between that we kind of need to look at again with fresh eyes? So 2.2.2 is where we have our origination agreements rule, right? So this requires ODFIs to enter into origination agreements with each of your originators, right? This is required. And through the agreements, your originators are bound by the rules and the laws that apply to them. And then as the ODFI, you have the right under the agreement to audit your originators and to terminate or suspend that originator if there is some sort of breach of the rules. So, NACHA requires you to have this. This is sort of how you are able to enforce the rules, enforce restrictions. But this is very important, but it is the legal foundation, right? It is not the oversight itself. This is the foundation, and we need to do more, not just telling us. So we'll get to that in just a second. 2.2.3. This is the next section, and we're going to be done here with the rules in just a second. I know this is not the fun part, but 2.2.3 talks about the ODFI's risk management responsibility when it comes to originators, right? And we see words like due diligence, assess, monitor, enforce, right? Well, that sounds great, but what does that mean? So let's break this down a little bit more. What is 2.
Julie, if I may,
Oh, yeah.
our tech support just came in with a reminder to for the audience to please submit your questions to the Q&A panel.
Oh, yeah.
See that Q&A at the bottom of your screen, or if you don't see it, it's in the little three dots called More, and you can submit questions there. We will have time towards the end to answer your questions.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely. Thank you, Trevor.
Mhm.
All right, so we are going to talk about 2.2.3. So what does this mean for the ODFI? Really two key things, right? Ensuring your originators are responsible enough to comply with the rules, right? So are your originators responsible enough to comply with the rules? And how do you know? So this is going to mean that you're going to need to do some form of an assessment with your originators. And we'll get to that in just a moment. And then the second part of this is enforcing those agreements that you've signed with your originators, right? So that means enforcing the rules, enforcing the restrictions that you've placed on them. And really, what this means is Nacha is sort of deputizing you as the deputized regulator when it comes to your originators, right? You're the deputy for Nacha, and helping your ODFI, or I'm sorry, your originators comply with the rules. So, what is Nacha's expectation when it comes to overseeing the originators? Well, we can look to the FAQs that Nacha has put out to find a reliance standard. That this is a very helpful thing to think about as you think about your plans for the rules, the new rules, and operationalizing for your originators. So the FAQs say originator compliance must be verified by appropriate oversight. Verified by appropriate oversight. So that's a very key phrase that we can come back to. And in case you forgot, right, this is our way of reminding you and reminding all of us that regulators only have eyes for you, right? They're not going to be talking to your originators. They are not going to be auditing your originators and their compliance. They have eyes for you, and they are going to want to know how are you doing that verification by appropriate oversight going forward. So if you like this little slogan, we have lots of stickers we can share with you. So if you see us out at conferences, we'll give you a sticker. All right, so let's keep going here. Verified by appropriate oversight. What does that mean auditors and examiners are going to be asking for or looking for when we get to that point down the road? Well, there's really kind of two general buckets that we can be thinking about as we start to create our processes and our procedures and thinking about the records and the evidence that we're creating. So first of all is thinking about how are you empowering your originators, right? So empowering your originators, helping them understand what requirements are applicable to them in their specific context, right? Their specific activity. And it doesn't necessarily mean, expecting them to digest a 700-page Nacha rule book and make sure they get everything out of that applies to them. So empowering your customers and then also assessing, right? Assessing their compliance. We've already talked a little bit about this. How do you know where your originators stand today and what they're doing? All right, so before we leave the rules, you've seen this, I'm sure, the new company entry descriptions around payroll and purchase. So for payroll, companies that are doing PPD credits for payroll salaries, right? Using that word payroll in the company entry description. Similar story with purchase, right? For web debits on e-commerce for tangible goods, making sure they're using the word purchase. And this is a requirement of all originators who do these types of transactions. However, it doesn't mean that you as the ODFI have to come behind them, right, and check every file, every entry. But we know that 2.1 is still with us, and ODFIs are still on the hook for everything your originators do and their compliance, right? So how are you going to help educate them, empower them, and know whether or not they're doing this? All right. So let's keep going. The million-dollar question in all of this, right? How do we get compliant? What does that actually look like in real life? So let's start kind of from a big picture perspective. And what is not just signaling that we can be thinking about as we plan for our compliance? So not just signaling two big things, right? They're turning their focus to originator compliance. Remember, we saw the perimeter expanding to our originators and third-party senders. And they're looking at you, the ODFI, to help empower and assess your originators while building those records to really help them become more compliant under the fraud monitoring world, right? So there's lots of different ways you could think about doing this, but here's a pretty simple mental model that we came up with that we think could be useful to you and useful to your teams as you guys think about your own institutions. So kind of thinking about this in three consecutive steps, right? So starting with assessing, right? Where does each of your originators stand today? What does normal transaction activity look like for them? Are they compliant or not, right? What's happening today and where might there be gaps, right? What's normal so that you can see what's abnormal, etc. Then that gives you information to move into education and remediation, right? What do your originators need to know? What do they need to learn? What gaps do they have that you can help them close? So really helping them be armed with actionable information. And then as you're doing 1 and 2, right, how are you documenting this and how are you going to maintain it going forward? Because anytime we do compliance, right, we need to make sure we're building documentation and building records. And it's also something that we can maintain and modify into the future. All right, let's hit on this idea of documentation, right? This sounds big, right? What does audit ready documentation look like? And don't worry too much about this right now. We're going to talk about how you can do this in just a moment, but just to kind of set the framework for what we want to work toward on our documentation. So a simple way to think about this is showing your work. How would you show your work with respect to that assess and that education and remediation? So if an auditor showed up tomorrow and said, hey, how are you doing oversight of your originators, what would you show them? So good documentation has evidence of controls, right? It's demonstrable in terms of it's verifiable, it can hold up, it's got good data in it, and it's also traceable to specific rules. So if you're asking an originator to do something, there's a rule or a requirement behind that, right? Okay, I know some of you have asked this question at your institutions, or maybe you've had this conversation internally. Well, why can't we just rely on origination agreements and disclosures to do all of this for us? Well, we already talked a little bit about this, right? 2.2 in 2.2.2, right? And an agreement is the legal foundation, but it is not the oversight. It is a requirement, but it does not do all the work for the ODFI. It tells originators what's expected of them, but it doesn't tell them how to actually comply. So what do we need to do to empower and assess our originators, therefore enforce the agreements? And then some of you I know have thought about questionnaires or surveys. We saw a few of you mark that on the poll earlier. So why couldn't we just build a questionnaire or a survey? Well, you could, but think about all that would go into that. How do you get all the rules in there, making sure it applies to all of your customers in their individual circumstances? And then, of course, getting it out to your originators, getting it back, doing the follow-up, and all of that. It becomes a very big effort. And we've spoken with many of you who have done this, and it's definitely a big undertaking. So I'm going to stop there. And the good news is we want to talk a little bit about how risk-based oversight can happen with Lexalign and how we can do this and empower you to do the verified by appropriate oversight with your originators. So on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Trevor, who is going to take it from here. So Trevor, over to you.
Thanks, Julie, and I want to echo you in thanking everybody who's taken time to be with us today. and we're going to work to make this. We are working to make this very valuable to you. One of the key things behind what Julie said is we based a lot of the analysis on conversations and presentations that we engaged with Nacha over the last 4 months, particularly at payment association events. And we heard them repeatedly talk about the ODFI responsibility, as well as kind of look askance when when presented with the concept of just like delivering the book or just presenting an agreement as sufficient for their verified by appropriate oversight standard that they have articulated in the Nacha FAQs for phase 1 of the new rules. And so what we've presented here reflects the signals that they've been given out, and Notch is very good at signaling what they're going to do. And we do believe that this is going to be a focus of audits going forwards. So we're not saying you can't just rely on the agreement, but we're saying that's probably a high risk strategy. So what do we do then? Because it sounds pretty daunting to do the kind of assessment, empowerment, and enforcement that's required. Well, the good news is I started thinking about this issue about 10 years ago or so as an attorney for banks and realized this was going to come down the pike, that more and more customers, rather, medium and small organizations are handling these high risk, highly regulated transactions and operations that used to happen internally at the bank. And the bank at the end of the day is always held, or the financial institution is always held responsible. So how do we both empower our customers to manage the risk and compliance of their operations, and then demonstrate that we have oversight, that we have visibility on it, and that we are acting on it in a risk-based way that's efficient and practical and doable, feasible. And so that's why I created Lexalign to enable you to do that. To take a look at Lexalign, we're going to take a look at 3 fictitious customers of the bank on doing different kinds of ACH originations. So Julie, do you want to advance the deck? So first of all, let's consider a company, Prairie Ridge Home Services. They're an HVAC and plumbing company. They were getting tired of paying credit card fees and decided to switch to direct payments. So they turned to the financial institution and they said, we'd like to use ACH to bill our customers. And the bank says, okay, we will give you access to PPD. So you're going to be able to do prearranged payments and deposits using that transaction code for your direct payments. And that worked for them for a while. They were getting customers going door to door at trade events, but then they decided they needed to grow faster, and they implemented a cold calling campaign. So they got a call center going, and they worked hard to get customers to agree on the phone and to get them to authorize the debits right there in that call. And they started growing very quickly. But because they were PPD, the financial institution, the ODFI, considered them a relatively low risk for them. Let's go on to the next company that we're going to take a look at, or in this organization. Let's say this is Lindenwood Community School District. They're using ACH in 2 ways. One is to pay their employees, so direct deposit, so consumer credits under the rules, recurring credits. And then also they're using PPD debits to obtain payment from their parents of their students for lunch programs and extracurricular programs. And we're going to see how that works. But for them, the bank said they're about a medium risk, and based on what the information the bank had. And then the third company is an online seller of pet products. And so they're exclusively online, and they do transactions all across the United States. And given the extent of their transactions, the fact that they're online and that doing web transactions brings with it a whole lot of rules and fraud prevention requirements, and that they're selling to so many people in so many different areas, the bank considers them a high risk customer. But then the bank decided to start using Lexalign and to assess how they're really handling the compliance of their operations, how they're really meeting the requirements under the rules. So I guess it's my turn to share. And I'm going to start sharing by looking at the bank side of Lexalign, the financial institution, I should say, because it applies also to credit unions. All right. So here we are looking at the financial institution dashboard. This is Sunshine Regional Bank. And they're just saying that 3 of their customers have completed an assessment using Lexalign. So Lexalign is based on the assessment concept. That is a concept that we saw that was in 2.2.2 and implicit in 2.2.3 and has been used by the Federal Trade Commission and other regulators as a foundational step for a compliance program. So we take the customer through an assessment, and then we obtain the results of that assessment from the customer. And this is all done electronically. The customer has their own dashboard. We'll take a look at this, but this is now we're looking at the results of those assessments. So these are the three companies that we talked about, starting with Prairie Ridge, the HVAC and plumbing company. We see that they completed their assessment. They got about a 93% confidence level. They all did. That's fine. That means that they were paying attention. There wasn't much inconsistency in their responses. They did know the answer to almost all the questions that were posed to them. We see that they opened their audit report. So Lexalign provides them an audit report after they complete their assessment to show them which rules apply and what gaps they have. But then we see something called the Lexa rating. So this is our rating, and you'll see over on the left is the institution risk ranking. That's the rating that you would give them based on the information that you have. So their transactions, the number of the return rates, the type of business they are, kinds of transactions that you've authorized them to do. And here we see what those are, but the Lexa rating is a little bit different. It goes from 1 to 5, 1 being the lowest risk, 5 being the highest risk. And what we're measuring here is specifically compliance with the rules that apply to them. So how compliant are they with the specific rules that actually apply to them based on their transactions and how they're obtaining authorization and from whom, et cetera. And we see that Prairie Ridge, which is considered low risk to the financial institution, is actually a Lexa 5 rating. And you can, by the way, you could filter for those higher risk customers. And they, in addition, have 11 of what we call risk factors. So these are the material deviations between what they're doing and what the rules require of them. And from here, we could drill down a little bit deeper to see what's going on. We could look at the results of their ACH assessment, their originator assessment. We can see that they attested to the accuracy of the responses, but they declined to commit to improve. So that's kind of a risk factor. And we can see what kind of transactions they're actually doing. Well, it turns out, as we described in that scenario, they're not doing PPD anymore. They're doing TEL transactions, right? And not only are they doing TEL transactions, they're doing TEL transactions based on cold calls. So now you know that they're doing that. And this is very vital for 2.2.3, because in 2.2.3, Nacha says you have to enforce the restrictions that are in the origination agreement as to the type of transactions. How do you do that if you don't really know what they're doing? They're still using PPD. So for all you know, they're still using, as far as the bank knows, they're still using PPD and direct payments, but they're actually doing TEL transactions because they're obtaining authorization via telephone from consumers for debits. And then we see on the right, there's this table called fraud prevention. We created this for the new rule 2.2.4, and it indicates is the customer meeting their explicit requirements under the rule or something that Nacha has stated in their FAQs, such as identity verification or change controls for certain types of trade. Here we say they're doing some things, but not necessarily perfectly. But you can see there's some TEL issues here because there are TEL rules that deal with fraud. And so they were taken through a TEL analysis based on how they obtained authorization. Then I'm going to click on this other tab here called Risk Factors Identified. Here are those 11 gaps between how they are operating and what the rules require for somebody doing their transactions. So each category and issue comes from the rules. They are referenced here. And then the gap is what's happening at the customer site. Now, you see this one that's highlighted or put in bold. They're doing a prohibited TEL transaction. They're not supposed to, under the rules, base a debit on a cold call with a consumer with whom they have no prior relationship. That's a prohibition under the rules. And this is really what scooted them up to a level 5 in the Lexa risk rating, because this becomes a risk not just to themselves, to their consumers for sure, but also to the ODFI that's permitting them to use ACH. So this is now a Nacha rules compliance issue. It could also be a consumer financial protection issue, depending on the state of that organization. But also the FTC or the state could come after them. So this becomes a really big issue. And then you see the status as to whether they've remediated or not. Why don't we take a look at the customer side to see what's going on their side? So they completed their assessment. They now have the results. If you want to see what it's like for them to complete an assessment, book time with us. We'll do a demo for you. But we don't have enough time on this to go through that. But we can look at what the results are of their assessment. And as I said, they open their audit report. So this tells them, this is really modeled after what the Federal Trade Commission calls the fundamental steps of a compliance and risk management program. It identifies for them what they're actually doing that brings them under the rules. So in this case, they're doing tail transactions. It then takes them through a gap analysis, saying, okay, you're doing tail. Let's see how you're doing tail. And so they were asked questions to determine if they were in compliance with all of the rules and issues in the left-hand column. The information they provided is in the next column. And then they were ranked. And they were identified where they had gaps or where they had insufficient compliance, which is thumbs down. And you can see there are quite a few rules that apply to them because they're doing tail transactions. And they'd had a lot of issues. They weren't really prepared. They're growing very quickly. They weren't really buttoned up. After this table, there's a link right below it. They can click, and it takes them to their action items. And here, the system tells them, this is what you do to go from where you are to a state of compliance. So this is how we assess and empower the customer. We tell them what they're doing. We tell them which rules are applicable to them. And then we tell them where they have gaps and what to do about those gaps. So they're empowered. It does something more to it, though. It's designed to enable you to shift the risk of the transactions to the customer. So if the customer does suffer fraud, does blame the bank, does threaten litigation, you have this document, which is a litigation liability mitigator for you under state law. But you can see here, it tells them what they need to do to fix that. And in the case of the prohibition, it tells them stop doing it and what they need to do to remediate that action. So you've told them to stop doing that based on this, this analysis here. They also incidentally get a policy document and a remediation checklist that they can use to tell you how they're doing and when they've remediated. And that then information would get updated on your side. You would see their scores improve, the risk factors come down, and so that you could demonstrate to your auditors and examiners that you are doing continuous oversight of your customer. Let's go to that next customer.
Hey, Trevor,
Yeah.
we had a good question come in related to that first originator. So it asks, what if we limit the SEC codes our customers have access to? Our agreement specifies which SEC codes they will have. Would this be sufficient?
Unfortunately, no, it's not the SEC code that determines the type of transaction that the customer is actually doing under the Nacha rules. The code is derivative of how they're actually obtaining authorization and whether it's from a corporate receiver or a consumer receiver. So if it's a consumer receiver, they're doing recurring debits via online, then it's a web transaction, even though you've only given them authority to use PPD, or maybe that's even hard coded into their payments interface. They're not really doing PPD, they're doing web. And so that's the key point here. When you go down to the customer site, when you look and see what are they actually doing, and incidentally, you can run reports on this system to find all customers who are doing TAL transactions or web transactions or CCD or what have you. This is how you would enforce. This is how you would show that you were enforcing the provision in 2.2.3 that you actually enforce those restrictions by saying by determining what the customer is actually doing and then reaching out to them and saying, hey, you're not authorized to do TEL transactions. You can't use that for, you have to implement another step. You have to then get the customer to agree in a written form to the transaction, and then it would be an agreement in writing, and then it would be direct payment, and then you would be able to use PPD for that. So this is designed to give you the data that you need in order to enforce those restrictions. I hope that was clear. I'm going to go, in the interest of time, just going to move forward, but feel free to continue with your questions. We saw that the school district had also completed their assessment. We want to see how they did. They obtained a Lexa rating of 3 with 8 risk factors. So they're sort of middling to high risk. Well, how are they so high if all they're doing is consumer credits and some debits? Well, it turns out when we look at it, they are doing pre-authorized recurring debits that are pre-authorized by presenting a check. Okay, they obtain a check from the customer, and they're using that as the basis for a recurring debit. A check does not suffice under Regulation E and the Nacha rules for a recurring debit. It suffices for a one-time debit, but not a recurring one. It does not contain the kinds of terms that are required under 2.3.2.1 and other rules that apply to the customer. We also find that even though they're doing consumer credits, they're doing payroll, remember, they don't have procedures for change control. This is a key thing that was picked up or presented by Nacha in the FAQs, that they said we really need the originator's help to prevent payroll redirections. That's why we have payroll as a new CED requirement for direct deposit. But we also need them Nacha is saying we also need your originators to implement change controls if they're doing corporate or consumer credits. And we assess that. They do not have those procedures. That's another risk factor against them. And that's why really they rose to the level of 3. And this begins to show you what the actual cases are. So the CED, which comes from Appendix 3, they were unaware of the rule and don't do it, they said. And then in debits, they were pre-authorizing consumers based on a single check, and that's not considered sufficient under Reg E or the Nacha rules. And so on the customer side, if we go to that customer, we see their ACH audit report would say that they're doing PPD for the consumer credits, and it indicates that for those debits that are pre-authorized by consumers solely by providing a check, there's no real SEC code for that because it's not an authorized transaction, but PPD is probably the most likely one. And then in the analysis, it would show them the use of a single check as a sole form of authorization does not suffice. It's a gap in their compliance. And then they would be given this action item, which is, first of all, to stop using it and to remediate it by reaching out to their customers and obtaining a written and clear statement from them that authorizes the prior debits and any future debits on those accounts. So that's how the Lexalign informs the customer what they're doing and where they're required to, which rules apply to them, et cetera, and how to comply with those. If we were to go to that very last one, the web transaction company that we considered high risk because of the nature of the transactions, it turns out they got a Lexa rating 1, which is a very good rating with 0 risk factors. And if we drill down, we can see that they are quite buttoned up. They have a compliance officer in place. They are meeting all of the web requirements when it comes to fraud preventions, fraud safeguards. And when they have risk factors, they don't really have any risk factors. And if we go to their audit report, we would see that they're doing web authorized by consumers on the web online and both recurring and one time. So they have some people on subscriptions for pet food. And then if we look at the web analysis, taking them through those basic rules, identity verification, security, authorization, how they obtained authorization, were the terms sufficient? Are they presented online in a way the customer would see them before providing authorization? Are they clear enough under the um, uh, relevant rule? How do they obtain the consumer's authentication? Um, did they do the fraud detection with validating account numbers and routing numbers, et cetera, and using the correct SEC codes? Are they using the purchase in the company entry description that Julie mentioned? And are they retaining their records for sufficient time? In each case, they got a thumbs up. They are, based on their responses, they are meeting those requirements. Now, based on those responses is a very important term, right? Because we have this phrase that says verified by appropriate oversight. What is appropriate oversight and what does verify mean? Here's some good news. You're entitled to rely on your customer statements, right? They have signed an agreement with you. They have committed to following the rules. You are entitled to assess them by taking them through an assessment. Again, that word comes from 2.2 and 2.2.3. And and if they say they are, then you're entitled to relieve them, because under American law, under broader than just the financial laws, broader than just the Nacha rules, but actually in the federal criminal code, it is the duty of the customer to speak truthfully to the bank. And if they were to speak untruthfully in the context of obtaining something from the bank, such as credit, which ACH involves, then and the bank were harmed from that, then that would be fraud on the bank, textbook fraud in the bank, for which there are very, very serious penalties for the customer. We don't hit them over the head with that, but we could. But we find that the customers take this seriously. We find that 4 out of 5 of them complete their assessment based on automated emails that go out to them to tell them to do so. And then they get this very rich and vital information for their compliance. And you get the information here that shows that you are managing, not only that you are doing your oversight, but then enables you to do that risk-based risk management by identifying those customers who are higher risk and going after them in a very targeted and efficient way. So that's how Lexalign helps you to meet the assess, empower, record keeping, and enforcement obligations under the rules, including the new 2.2.4, the fraud monitoring rule. Do we have any more questions
Yeah,
about
absolutely. And
sharing?
before we get to questions, I was just going to sort of remind everyone that Trevor shared with you kind of what the outputs are for both the financial institution and originators after an assessment is completed. But we would love to walk you through kind of the originator experience as they're completing an assessment. So please connect with us and we can show you that as soon as we can all get together. So Trevor, our first question is around what happens if an originator just flat out refuses to respond to outreach of any kind related to the new rules? Just, I don't want to see this. I don't want to deal with it. What do we do?
Well, that is a data point in and of itself as to their commitment to compliance and their commitment to being transparent. And then it's up to you to decide how to act on that. Um, are they responsible enough to have access to ACH if under their origination agreement, as Julie pointed out, you have the right to assess them, to audit them is the word in that provision, and then they're refusing to be audited. So that's up to you to decide. But in those cases, you might want to have a more direct conversation with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you have questions, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A. You're welcome to just type them in there. We'd love to answer those for you. So another question, just kind of as people think about how to tackle these new requirements, Trevor, would it be sufficient to just ask originators to send over any policies or procedures or process documents that they have today? Would that be sufficient?
I mean, it could be. We can't predict what a given auditor or examiner will say or what Nacha would say in that case. But having them provide it means that then you have a duty to review it.
Mm.
So you would be reviewing against the rules, and you probably have questions as to whether they're in compliance with that policy, right? Because as you know from your own audits, it's vital to have a policy, and we do present them with a policy. in addition to an audit report. So they do have a policy for compliance, whether it comes to security or ACH, or if they're doing RDC, that. Um, but when you're examined or audited, it's not just show us your policies, thank you very much. It's okay, now we're going to assess whether you're in compliance with that policy. And so there would be an additional work that would reasonably be expected by an auditor or examiner. You might get lucky; they might say that's fine, but there's a good chance that they'll say, "What did you do with this?
Mm.
Can you show us your work?"
Show your work.
We
Absolutely.
really try to create Lexalign so it's doing all that hard lifting for you and then presenting you with this really valuable data that you can then do very take pinpoint actions or interventions, and can show that you're doing that risk-based risk management, because the system does the assessment for you.
Absolutely. All right. So thinking about this notion of risk-based and kind of understanding the risk-based nature of each of our originators, it's often the case that financial institutions already have some sort of risk rating for every one of their originators, right?
Mhm.
And then you're sort of giving, or through Lexalign's giving financial institutions now a Lexa rating with their originators. So how do those two work together when it comes to, you know, helping the originator assessing the overall risk?
Sure. What's important to know is they're looking at different data sets, right? What your risk ranking is based on the data that you already have. So what did they present to you when they first became a customer, or during the last application they did for a product that they've obtained? What kind of business they are, right? What is their transaction history and return rates, et cetera. Those all go into, I'm guessing, and anything you can get from a commercial database, such as what is their DMB rating or experience score or FICO score. Those are all going into your internal rating. What the Lexa rating is looking at is specifically the information that the Lexalign system is collecting from the customers, which goes to what's actually happening internally at that business. How are they interacting with their customers, or their receivers rather? How are they handling their processes? Are they secure? Down to, is their Wi-Fi encrypted? If they have it and rely on it, how are they guarding access to their banking, their online banking, et cetera? That's what we're looking at, which is again internal to the business, giving you visibility that you didn't otherwise have. We are not counting those other kinds of data that you've already contemplated for your risk ranking, so that nothing is double counted. And so it's meant to be completely complementary to the bank's or the financial institution's risk rate ranking, so that you have a more complete picture of your customer. And indeed, the financial institutions that use Lexline do tend to use the Lexa rating in conjunction with the other when they're doing decisions on like renewals or other credit decisions. So it's designed to be helpful in that respect as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Um, Short question, do these rules apply to consumer originators?
No, they do not.
They do not. Um, all right, those are all the questions that have come in. Are there any other questions that are on anyone's mind before we wrap up today?
I would say though, on that last point, there's sort of a gray area where you have somebody who might be a consumer customer who's actually acting as a business. Arguably, the rules would apply then. Those are kind of edge cases, probably not the highest risk to you, but if you do find out that somebody's using their retail account as a business for business purposes, it might be worthwhile to assess them along with your business originators.
Awesome. All right, so I think that's a great place to stop for today. We did see a question come in around will the slides be available after today's session? The answer is yes. So you will get an email later on with resources, including the slides and the recorded webinar. So feel free to share this with colleagues. We know this is something that can be a good resource for other teammates as everyone is learning and planning together. So, as we said, if this is something where you want to actually see the originator experience, see more of kind of how Lexalign comes together, we would love to show it with you. And I know many of you on the call have already seen it and you're here to continue learning. So we love that you're back and we love that you're staying with us. So I hope everyone has a wonderful Friday, a wonderful weekend, and we're going to be seeing many of you next week in San Diego at Nacha. So thank you so much and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.